Hello, my name is John Paul Stolle, and today I'm going to be talking about how the car changed the city of Houston and our nation forever. Now, the concept of cars affecting our cities and our nation as a whole is definitely not a new idea and has been covered extensively by a number of authors. However, there is a notable lack of literature on specifically how it affected Houston. And as someone that's from Houston, it was naturally within my interest to pursue this topic and consider how the car may have affected Houston in a similar way to other cities across our nation and how it may have affected it in unique ways. Now, over the course of my research, first, I decided to get myself situated within the existing literature that's out there. This included a number of primary and secondary sources, and really helped me understand how the historians across our nation and outside consider the car to have affected our nation, its infrastructure, and urban development. From here, I was able to apply these concepts to analyzing how Houston in particular was affected by the car. First and foremost, I researched the historical development of roads across Houston, and the impact that the car had on these roads and the motivation that building these roads had from the car. A number of key figures stand out over the course of this history, and I will be discussing their role. And additionally, we can see how these changes represent a change in design and a change in assumption about our roads. And finally, though it is only one city, Houston, as the third largest city in the nation, is representative of our nation's roads. And we can really apply the lessons that we learned from looking at Houston to really our nation as a whole and the history of our nation. In the early 20th century, the development and the popularization of the Model T resulted in a change in how we understood getting about our nation. And this is something that a number of authors have written about, but it is an important fact to understand for the rest of this presentation that this single invention really changed how we understood our roads as a nation. Now, there were a number of resources already out there about this topic and discussing this. A great one is Inventing Autopia, which delves specifically into Los Angeles, and many of the others cover Los Angeles as one of the original Autopias of our nation, so to say. In researching each of these really established my understanding of the topic and really provided me with an understanding of what our nation as a whole did in reaction to this automobile and how it reacted to it. Though not all of these resources made it into the creation of this presentation directly, each of them overall contributed to my understanding of the topic and the development of this project. So first and foremost, as I said, Inventing Autopia describes the impact that the automobile had in the far west in Los Angeles. And in the book, Jeremiah Axelrod develops his concepts based on Kevin Lynch's concept of legibility and its 5 categories, which are landmarks, edges, nodes, districts, and paths, and how each of these really develop how we understand a city. And then from here, he used these concepts to really see and analyze how the city was impacted by the automobile. One of the key things that I pulled from this reading is that there are shared experiences among us, and that's how we plan out our cities, is through these planned experiences. As Axelrod said, how urbanities share experiences of a particular urban form shape the way they go about imagining the sort of place their city should ideally be. And it's these shared experiences that really, develop our key assumptions for what it means to live in a city. And another one is by Clay McShane. And though his is more about the culture and maybe the architectural changes that resulted um, because of the automobile, his thesis really influenced my understanding of the topic deeply, because he presented the automobile as almost like a paradigm shift in how we thought about cities. He said that city residents perceive their streets in a different way, thinking of them more as traffic ways than open public places. And this was his thesis, that when the car was introduced to America, there was immediately a paradigm shift. Now, our cities were no longer filled with streets to connect us to the rest of our neighborhood. Now they had roads, which connected them to the entirety of not just their neighborhood, even to their whole city, and even to the rest of the nation, when we start getting into concepts like freeways and highways. An additional resource that influenced my research heavily was Roadside America, not only for the amazing visuals that it represented across our nation, but also because of the perspective that it offered on Houston, which is a limited resource in the literature right now. It said about Houston that planners and cities officials, pressured by the demands of the automobile, acquiesced during the 1920s to a new creed: the city practical rather than the city beautiful, and that the automobile killed the life of the streets that existed in downtown Houston and elsewhere. And while these tend to be rather negative statements, they do represent a kind of change in thought that occurred in Houston in the 1920s up through the 1960s and even today. So, to understand how Houston fits within this picture of Autopia and the car of America, we're going to look at the case of Houston, a behemoth with no zoning laws. So our story begins in 1913 with one of the first plans for city planning across Houston, with little before that had much success. So the document that I was able to find is called Houston Tentative Plans for its Development by Arthur Comey. He wrote this around the 1913s, and he developed one of the first plans for Houston. He begins his report with a rough estimate for where the population of Houston would go in the next 50 years, because Houston was growing greatly at that time and was seeing a great increase in population. And so by 1970, he made a conservative guess that there would be roughly 700,000 people in the population of Houston by the 1960s. Fast forward to actual America in 1960s, and Houston has a population of 1.1 million. So a little bit under, to say the least. This represents how much growth Houston really did experience in this time. And the fact that planners were trying to get around this and plan for this growth, and even still were not fully prepared for the inundation of people that would be entering the city. So in his plan, the main components are designing a loop around the city, which is something that we can even see today and is reflective of modern Houston. So just a basic look on Comey's design is this red circle that I've traced out is a basic loop that Comey designed in 1913. And today we can see that much of that loop does not remain. However, the basic concept of a loop around the city of Houston does. And while this is something that's common in many large cities, having the concept of a loop, Houston was one of the earliest cities to employ it. Additionally, Kome was one of the first to put in the concept of widening the streets. And while this is not a revolutionary concept, it's a concept that comes back again and again, not just in the streets, but in highways and freeways. The solution that many city designers often come back to is the concept of widening the roads and the forms of transportation. And this can be seen as early as this report from 1913. So as you can see here, Kome presents kind of his concepts behind widening streets and the benefits that it offers. And in his writing, he actually took some inspiration from the city of Vienna, who was also using this concept to widen their streets. In retrospect, in a report that was written in the 1960s about Kome's report, is that his recommendations, although received with interest, must have seemed too ambitious both politically and administratively to be implemented. And this is what ended up happening of this report, is that much of it did unfortunately not come to fruition. But what it does represent is a overall interest in improving and planning out the city of Houston. And his report would go on to inspire many of the men and women who actually were successful in planning out the city of Houston after him. As you can see, this is the impact that Kome had on planning out Houston. In the 1920s, there were three men that would ultimately come into in charge of Houston that would be the leaders of this kind of change that was about to happen in Houston. The first of which is Mayor Holcomb, who was a mayor for nearly 40 years in Houston. And he would see the change of many roads and construction and designs around Houston. Additionally, Hare was the city's professional planning consultant for almost nearly as long. And then a lawyer by the last name of Hogg, who made public planning his personal cause. These three men have been charged with really planning out the early successes in planning out Houston. And though I say successes, these changes to designing Houston are not without failure. So Mayor Holcomb in 1922 created the first city planning commission that would immediately fail because it had not been properly planned out or put into official record, and no financial support had been set aside. So the members, after meeting maybe once or twice, stopped meeting, and the planning commission effectively died. So the second council was created in 1924, and it was somewhat successful until funds eventually failed again, and they stopped meeting again. This would be followed by a number of failed councils until finally the fourth council was established by, again, Mayor Holcomb, where after winning a re-election, he selected Ralph Ellifrit, who would finally be able to find some success in making changes in planning the roads across Houston. As a result of this selection of Ralph Ellifrit, and finally a successful planning council, the fourth one, in 1929, the report of the City Planning Commission took place. It was the first plan since 1913, Kome's plan, that really had any success whatsoever. But the 1929 report would unfortunately go on to fail due to the depression across our nation. Later in 1940, as planning finally was finding some success, Mayor Holcomb made a decision that would continue to be one that was reflected across the city in years to come. In 1940, he terminated all streetcar operations and all tracks and cars were removed. And this was ultimately to achieve his goal of making a superhighway from Galveston to Houston, and connecting the two and making a large form of connection between the two cities. Uh, and while this single event is not necessarily unique in the history of Houston, it is one of the first that represents the creation of a large-scale road of connection between two cities that would ultimately be reflected in highway and highway and freeway after this one, that would ultimately make Houston the super center of highways that it is today. Now, in 1942, Van, a man by the name who went by Van, and Ralph Ellifrit, along with the rest of the commission, constructed something called the Major Street Plan, which is something that can even be found today. And they created this plan with the goal of finally, after the failure of so many reports before them, to actually plan out the city of Houston. And this was the first one that would go on to have serious success. A great example of this is that while the plan itself did not actually lay the foundation for highways or something to that effect, it did suggest where highways could be placed, and each of the locations that they suggested went on to be major highways for Houston. These three are the Gulf Freeway, Memorial Parkway, and North Freeway. And to anyone not from Houston, these really don't mean much, but as someone from Houston, I can say that each of these three roads are someone that any Houstonian knows about. And these two men really established the groundwork for what would become these three major freeways and highways. This was the fruit of their labor. This is the Major Street Plan for Houston. And it is ultimately a representation of the finally successful plan that was created in 1942. So thus began the age of freeways. In 1943, the first major freeway, the Gulf Freeway, laid its first tracks. In 1945, the commission approved US 75 route, which is now I-45, a major highway in Houston. And a year later, the commission approved US 90, which is now I-10, which is a transnational road. And they simply approved for it to be extended into the city of Houston. And this represents not just roads across a city, but roads to the rest of the nation, which even 30 years later would have been unthinkable in the eyes of Comey. I think this was perfectly represented by Ralph Ellifrit when he wrote that we actually had more influence on the location of our freeways than almost any other city, as opposed to the highway department. In fact, we were way out ahead of them, which is a perfect concept of what really happened with this. These gentlemen, along with the rest of the commission, were really put in charge and given the reins to establish what highways and freeways across your city would look like. And take this as a good thing or a bad thing, but it represented the first final success of planning out a city that was trying to rebuild itself as it was gaining more citizens. And so whether this has the impact of our city being a fairly road-heavy city, it does represent a great improvement in the planning that was actually occurring in Houston. Now, 1940 is not the end of the story, but it does represent a significant mark of where Houston's roads would largely remain where they were, whether that's a couple more freeways or highways here or there, or maybe widening roads or widening highways. Houston's roads after the 1940s remain largely the same. Now, Houston's architecture is not without critique. And in fact, that was the main motivation for this presentation. Because as a Houstonian and as someone from a large city, I want to understand how our cities got the way that they did. And for Houston, a large critique of it is its design and its design around the car, as we can see here.
As I shimmied along the curb next to the guardrail, with high-speed cars and trucks passing by me, I thought about how ridiculous this was. I was balancing on a few centimeters of curb while crossing a 28-meter bridge with 7 lanes of car traffic. There was no consideration given to anybody who wasn't in a car, and there was no other alternative for people walking. At that moment, I decided that, if I lived through this walk, I wanted to live in a place that was the exact opposite of a place like this. When I made it to the other side, there was also no sidewalk, of course, and I crossed through some more parking lots to get to the luggage shop. Needless to say, I took a cab back to the hotel. Yeah, I took a taxi to go 800 meters.
So, as we can see, from not just bikes, Houston does suffer from a serious issue that many of our cities suffer from, which is a car-centric design. And while not just bikes is correct that this is absolutely troublesome for people that walk by feet, Houston is a result of its history. And for those that were designing Houston in the 1940s and earlier, this was the city of the future. Whether that means larger highways, bigger roads connecting you to the rest of your city and to the rest of your nation. It does come along with the inherent problems that he points out, and our city is truly a representation of that history, and it truly wears its history on its right shoulder. So what can we take from this? While Houston is not a perfect example, as a large city, it does represent a similar story that happened across our nation in the early 20th century, which is that our understanding as a nation of what a road really is changed in the early 20th century. And that is that it went from this idea that a road would connect you to your neighborhood and those nearby you and your local community. Now roads suddenly became your access to the rest of the world. A road connects you to the rest of your city, to the rest of your state, to your nation, and even to the rest of the world. Furthermore, this further expansion of what a road really is represents an increase in migration and ultimately a further convergence of our nation and our world. And that's why this topic really represents something that is vitally crucial to understand the development of transportation in the US across its history, and especially in the 20th century. Now, if you wish to do your own research, there are a number of resources I consulted in the course of this research, but if I was to point you to 2 or 3, I have placed cars by these great resources. First and foremost, for my primary sources, Comey and Fox represent great primary resources that present history as it was happening. For some excellent secondary sources, consider Slotboom's Building the System, which is a book that is dedicated to Houston freeways. Additionally, I tried to, as best as possible, include little tabs at the bottom of each slide with where information was coming from. So if you wish to do your own research, you may. And I encourage you to. Thank you. I hope you've enjoyed as much as I have enjoyed researching this, and I hope you have a deeper appreciation for the role that our roads serve and the city of Houston. Thank you.